Hey, Eagle fans, this is EaglefanKarl, and Happy New Year to everyone out there. Welcome to Black Monday, the day that traditionally head coaches get their walking papers. Obviously, we don't have to worry about that because we're on the other end of the spectrum and having a look at the playoffs coming up. And I'll get to the playoffs in a moment, but let's first start off and talk about that game against the Cowboys yesterday, which was just flat out unwatchable. This was like a preseason game. The team really it didn't seem like they had much energy. It was clear that they weren't going to try and win the game. And the thing that only made me feel a little bit better about that is Dallas was trying to win the game and they looked just as bad. So that was the only really redeeming thing that came out of this game. As we always do, let's go ahead and start with some studs and duds. And I really don't know how much I can do for a game like this, but we'll start off, as always, when we lose a game, we'll start off with studs, and I want to give an honorable mention to Nate Sudfeld. I know there's going to be a lot of Eagles fans out there that are going to be saying he should start in the playoffs over Nick Foles, but just remember, despite the fact of what his numbers looked like, he went 3 quarters and the Eagles scored no points. So as good as he looked in terms of his completion percentage, ultimately he wasn't able to move the ball and get them into scoring position. And the other interesting thing about his completion percentage, though, is in reading this morning, I realized that he actually set an NFL record for best completion percentage by a quarterback in his first game with a minimum of 20 attempts. So hats off to Nate Sudfeld. I think he looked good enough. And if something happened to Nick Foles, at this point, the way Nick Foles is playing, I don't think it would be that much of a step down if we had to go to Nate Sudfeld. But I do actually have 5 studs for this game, believe it or not. And no big surprise, it's going to be weighted heavily towards the defense. My number 5 stud is going to be Najee Good. He seemed to be all over the place. We were really good at stopping Ezekiel Elliott in this game for the most part. He ended up getting some yardage towards the end of the game that put him over 100 yards. It was the first 100-yard rusher the Eagles have given up in quite some time. But ultimately, I think the defense did a really good job of containing him. That also then goes to some of my other studs for this game. So my number 4 stud is going to be Stephen Means, who actually came up then with the sack as well. So he really, I think, played well. And all these guys are getting an opportunity to play that they normally wouldn't. So it looked like they took the opportunity and really made the most of it when they got in there. My number 3 stud is going to be Vinny Curry. I think that he really anchored that defensive line, I think, and really played well for that defensive line. He was causing havoc for the Cowboys' offensive line. Ended up getting a few holding calls against their left tackle. So really, he was in the backfield all day and causing trouble for the Cowboys' offense. And those are really the decent players that I saw on the defensive side of the football. My number 2 stud of the week is going to be the Eagles fans who went to that game, braved that weather, and watched that horrible game. That was really, if you think about it, the one thing about preseason games is that usually the weather's at least nice, so you can go there and just sort of enjoy the game. It's more like going to a baseball game. You just sort of sit back and enjoy. People that decided to go to that game yesterday and actually sat through that whole game yesterday really had to be committed because they were watching a slop game in some brutally cold weather. So my hat's off to any Eagles fans that stuck it through that game because that really took some effort and some loyalty to the team. And then really, is there any surprise who my number 1 stud's going to be in a game where we score no points, but ultimately field position was a really important thing in this game, and he did everything he could to help us, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but Donnie Jones, our punter, has got to be the number 1 stud of the game. And that really just tells you a lot about how this game went in general, is the fact that I'm putting the punter as the number 1 stud of the game. But really, he did everything he could. And even on the one drive they did have that resulted in the touchdown, Donnie Jones did everything he could to get that drive started off right by pinning them at the 1-yard line. So he does everything, and then unfortunately the defense, I think at that point, was probably just a little too gassed from everything that they had been trying to do all game, and so as a result, they ended up giving the long touchdown drive. But Donnie Jones did everything he could in that game to put the Eagles in a position to try and win it. Unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. But Donnie Jones, you're my number 1 stud of the game. So let's talk about my duds of the game, and I'm going to have a little bit of fun with this at the beginning. My number 4 dud of the game is going to be my random number generator for coming up with just an absolutely brutal score of 34-33. I know that, I didn't take this prediction seriously because the game was such a difficult game to really try and decide, who was going to end up coming up with, a performance in this game, who's actually going to show up to play, who the Eagles were actually going to play on the field, and whether or not the Cowboys would really try hard. So it was sort of a difficult game to predict, so that's why I just decided to leave it to chance. In retrospect, I probably should have not put the number as high as 40 to have my number generator go to. But this game, with the weather the way it was clear there wasn't going to be a lot of scoring in this game, and it made that prediction look really bad. The only thing, obviously, I can sort of fall back on is the fact that I wasn't the one making it. I don't think I would have predicted a 6-0 score. I probably would have had both teams in double digits at least. But unfortunately, that prediction was way off because my random number generator basically sucked. My number 3 dud of the game is going to be Nick Foles. He's only number 3 because he only played for a quarter, but he just did not look good in this game, and I'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. My number 2 dud of the game is going to be Torrey Smith. Early on in this game, the Eagles could have gotten something going and maybe really had a first drive that would have ended up in points, and then you could have ended up pulling the starters and saying, hey, listen, we're going to consider that a win and, move on. But he drops a ball that literally hit him right in the gut. And, it would have been a 3rd down completion, probably would have put them in field goal range. And, so when you drop a ball like that, it's really unacceptable. And as a result of that, he's got to end up on the duds list. My number 1 dud of the game, though, isn't really any surprise. It's got to be Doug Peterson. And not for his play calling, but the way he used his players. I was not a fan of the fact that they only played Nick Foles for a quarter. Like I had said in my prediction video, if he had had a good first drive or two and they scored points and then they pulled him, I don't think that would have been the right thing to do, but I would have understood it, and I think that would have made sense. What they did instead was they go ahead and they pull him after a quarter of action where he didn't look good, and this team looked bad on offense. And this is now 5 quarters of lousy football, basically, that he has played, and you're not going to give him any more reps going into the playoffs, and that's a real problem. So as a result of that, I really have to criticize Doug and really wonder what's going to happen now going into the playoffs. Now, ultimately, if the offense looks great in that first playoff game, all this criticism is going to be, completely undone. But I think we're really going to have to rethink what he did in this game if we end up looking flat and losing that first playoff game. So let's go ahead and turn our back, though, on that game and look forward to the playoffs, because the Eagles are division champs. They are the number 1 seed in the NFC. All their playoff games or game will be at home. So there is something to look forward to still in this postseason. I'm not going to be a total doom and gloomer after these last 2 games, although I do have some real concerns about how our offense is playing. And I think a lot of what it has to do with is, what potential matchups we could face in the playoffs. So there is the seeding for the NFC in the playoffs. The Eagles obviously could play either the 4, 5, or 6 seed in that divisional round, depending on what happens in the wild card round. Of those 3 teams that they could potentially play, the one that worries me the most is the Saints at number 4, and that has to do more with Drew Brees than anything. And I know they've been much more dependent on their running game this year, and we've been good at stopping the run. But when you've got a team that's got a decent running game and then they've got a real experienced quarterback like Drew Brees, that really concerns me as to what they could end up doing to our defense. And really, that's the way we've got to look at all of these matchups, I think, that we could potentially have in the playoffs, is how does our defense match up against their offense? Because at this point, our offense is just going to hopefully have to find a way to score a few points. If we're going to win playoff games, it's probably going to end up being games like 17-13 or something like that. We're not going to end up blowing teams out like we were in the beginning of this season when we had Carson Wentz as our quarterback. That's just not going to happen now. So if we are going to win games, it's going to have to be with defense in low-scoring games. After watching some of the games yesterday, I turned the red zone on for the 4:30 game, so I got to see all three of our potential opponents in the red zone because they were going back and forth to all the interesting games. And the Saints, Falcons, and Panthers were all playing in significant games yesterday. So you got to see a little bit of all of them. Of them, the Panthers probably had the least to play for, but ironically, if the Panthers would have played hard in that game, they actually would have ended up becoming, they would have actually ended up winning their division and, taking over for the Saints, as I think they would have actually moved up to the number 3 seed, and the Saints would have fallen down to the number 5. Ultimately, then, the Panthers really hurt their chances in the way they played that game because it didn't really look like they played that hard. I've got to say, though, interestingly enough, that's probably the team that probably I would want the most, but it's probably the team that we're least likely to get because I don't see the Panthers going into New Orleans and beating them, although I will be rooting for that to happen. The Falcons, I think, have a chance at beating the Rams, and it's really going to be a matter of how that Rams team responds to the fact they've never been in the playoffs before. And the Falcons obviously have had quite a bit of playoff experience getting to the Super Bowl last year. So that's going to be the interesting dynamic of that game. And basically, I'm rooting for both road teams to win next week because anything that can happen to avoid us having to play the Saints in the first round would be preferable in my estimation. So those are the possible opponents we could face in the divisional round. I'm not even going to get into the Rams and Vikings as possible opponents down the road. We'll cross that bridge if we come to it. But at this point, the Eagles obviously are going to be playing in that divisional round game. It's been announced they're going to be playing the first game on divisional round weekend, which in one way is sort of interesting, as a fan. I'm glad that we'll be the first game. We'll get it out of the way. We won't have to worry about, sitting through other games and really, being nervous going into those. But the flip side of that is if the Eagles end up losing that game, I might not even want to watch another divisional playoff game going forward. That's how disgusted I'll be. That's generally what happens when the Eagles lose a playoff game is for the rest of that weekend, I generally hardly can even bring myself to watch football. So we'll see, though. I don't know how I'll react given how the team has played and given the fact that, we do have the major injury in place. So it might end up being, a little easier for me to accept a loss and therefore more willing to watch those games. But at the end of the day, I've got to look at it this way. The Eagles are the number 1 seed with a really good defense going into the playoffs. And that I still does think give us some hope as we go forward. And if Doug Peterson can figure out how to use this offense in a way to get some scoring from the offense, it's enough. If we can get to 17 points a game, hopefully the defense can play well enough to hold the other team below that, and we can end up winning games that way. The one thing I did find curious about Doug Peterson's use of personnel yesterday was the fact that Jay Ajayi was an inactive player. That suggests to me that he's the most crucial player that they view as a running back on offense. I hope that means they're going to use him more in the playoffs. And if that's the case, then that does give me a little bit of hope that maybe they're going to try and rely more on the running game than they have in the past. And that very well could be what they do. And if they do, I think that gives us a little bit better of a chance. We'll get into exactly what they could potentially do, though, when we actually know who our opponent is and we can talk a little bit more intelligently about how that matches up against the Eagles. So I'll go ahead and talk about that in my preview video for the divisional playoff game. That will be my next video. I'm not going to be doing anything for the wild card round. I'll check in after the wild card games are over and before the divisional games start, before our game plays on Saturday the 13th. I'll go ahead and check in and let you know what I think about that game. Leave your comments below, though. Let me know what you think. Let me know which playoff matchup you think is best for the Eagles. Have you abandoned all hope and you think that it's hopeless and there's no way we're going to win any of these games? Do you think we actually have a shot at winning, a couple games in the playoffs, depending on who our opponents are? And if so, which opponents would you like to see us end up playing in the playoffs? And then, of course, let me know what you thought about the Dallas game. If you had any comments about who you thought played well and who you thought ended up sort of being the duds of the game, leave those in the comments below. I'll check in, of course, before the divisional playoff game when the Eagles will be playing next. Until then, fly, Eagles, fly.